Hi everyone, welcome. Many of you who are regulars here on my channel kind of know what to expect already just from seeing one of these blank labels here. But for those of you that don't know what this is representative of, in my wormery, I like to label all my boxes, all my bins with a little label just showing the start date, sometimes the breed of worm that's in there, maybe some other additional information. So the fact that I've got this label sitting here indicates that we're probably going to be launching a bin today, assuming everything goes well. And guess what? I've actually purchased a number of brand new bus boxes, and these are black. I've got 4 of them. And this will be the first one of the new black bins that we're going to be putting into service. Let me elaborate really quickly on what we're talking about here. I've got my information board here that I usually share some of my details about my plans with you on. And what we're looking to do here is to tend to some European night crawlers that have been in migration mode now in the system that they inhabit for, well, let's see here, 36 days. So here I've got a little illustration showing where these worms came from. You can actually see the yellow buckets off in the background. They lived in those buckets for 292 days, and now over the past 36 days, they've been living in a bus box where this migration is going on. The migration, I like to do kind of horizontal migration. Doing it in the yellow buckets was impractical. So the material in all 3 of those buckets was placed into a single bin. And over the past 36 days, we've been migrating the worms. And there was one occasion already over here, 24 days ago, where we did a haul out. And the haul out of the worms that came out of that actually ended up back in those buckets. That's another story, though. That's kind of the future. We're still dealing with the past to try to bring closure to this now 328-day-old environment that these worms have been living in, and from which we've already extracted a certain number of worms to launch off those yellow breeder buckets. But it's been 24 days now since we did that first haul out, and over those past 24 days we did check in on the bin a couple times to feed it. Well, it got a feeding and then it went 12 days to replenish the feeding. It's been another 12 days now, so 24 days since that first haul out. We're going to be doing a second haul out. I got my little haul out plastic container here, and I got my glove. So we're going to get the new bin out of the way to make a little room so we can get the system that we're going to be hauling the worms out of. It's right here on the shelf. And as I do sometimes, I've got this migration zone set up where there's food and moisture. And then the old castings that we're trying to move the worms out of sits over here, exposed to the air, drying, hopefully motivating the worms living in it to move out. So I'm curious to see how many of them have moved out. We're going to get them launched off into that new system now. So I'm going to slip on a glove and we're going to get to work. Now before we jump into haul out number 2, just a quick recap of some information I didn't mention down here in haul out number 1. The number you see here represents the estimated 225 worms that were placed into each of those buckets that we saw earlier, amounting to haul out number 1 consisting of 675 worms in total. The way we got that number was really just me estimating that each bucket got 150 worms, but based on feedback I got in the comments, I like to average not only my guess but the viewers' guesses too. The viewer guess was that there was probably twice that many worms placed into each bucket. So somewhere between 150 and 300 is the value of 225 per bucket, amounting to a total number of worms hauled out during the first haul out of 675. So like we do sometimes, I'll be asking for your input at the end of this video to help me estimate how many worms we managed to round up in haul out number 2 here. I think we're going to be rebuilding this feeding zone and trying to initiate the ongoing migration of the worms out of the material, because something tells me that they're probably not completely out of the finished castings yet, but we're going to assess that momentarily. Let me just finish evacuating the worms from this plastic. But you know, since my best guess is that this plastic's just going to go back to covering the horizontal migration feeding zone when we're done here, I'm going to fold this in half so the space in between the 2 sheets remains nice and damp. Any little worms I missed are just going to stay there and remain cozy and comfortable until we're finished here. So this, you can see this piece of cardboard's riddled with holes so as to not let it become an obstacle to prevent the worms from making their way over into the feeding area. And this stuff, like I mentioned earlier, has been left uncovered, hopefully allowing it to dry a bit, because the dryness is going to, you know, sort of repel the worms. So I'm going to be showing these worms a couple times. Number one is going to be showing them now as we extract them. And then number two is going to be when we release them. So use both of those opportunities to try to get a good look at how many worms we've got here. And then when we get to the end, like I said, I'll be polling you, the viewers, for your input on how many worms we launched off the new system with. Man, they've really done a number on the bedding that was in here. In fact, just the level, I mean, like the level of this is up here. This might have collapsed and settled a little bit too, but I believe we did pretty much start this thing 24 days ago at the same level. So whatever number of worms did make their way over into here, they've been busy chewing up the bedding and eating the food. So yeah, I don't see a whole lot of leftover bedding. It's almost all castings here, but we're going to begin hauling this out and just emptying the horizontal migration feeding zone carefully. And you know, sometimes I like to pull out the bedding materials that make this up and maybe bring only the finished castings along with the worms to their new home, because this bedding could probably get reused and be effective when we rebuild the feeding zone. And you know, none of this has to be so precise, but I just have this sort of obsessive tendency. But you know, since I did only build that new bin for them yesterday, regrettably there's just not been a lot of time for that new environment that they're going to be moved into to sort of prime and get cozy for them. I mean, it's nice and damp, but as far as microbial activity in that new environment, it's going to be pretty much next to nothing. So perhaps leaving some of this bedding with the worms to go with them over into the new space is probably a good idea, because yeah, you know, the new environment is somewhat sterile. So I guess that top covering of newspaper can get retained for the rebuild of the feeding area. Perhaps these chunks of corn and whatever worms are stuck to them or are crawling around within them can just come back on the rebuild of the feeding zone. But I guess whatever castings they've created over here, as well as any leftover food bits, which I believe is just going to be corn, we'll get them moved over. Lots of nice castings in here and quite a number of worms collecting. I'm attempting to give myself a good look at each handful so that we can come up with a realistic estimate of how many worms we've hauled out here today. And that handful had a lot of worms in it. And let's not, oops, making a mess here. Stuff that sticks to my glove is going all over the place. It's on the table. All right, let's try not to make too much of a mess here. I'm just thinking if there's any other chunks of corn in here. Here's another chunk of it. We'll just evict any worms hanging out on it and retain that for the rebuild of the feeding area. But whatever. Any worms that end up back in the collection area will be part of the next haul out number 3. Let's keep haul out number 2 moving here. It does look to me like that perforated cardboard partition will probably be reusable. Just see how it looks. Yeah, it's hardly been degraded at all. A lot of times the worms just go crazy nibbling that down too. But luckily we built up the feeding area well enough for them with bedding that they were able to keep themselves occupied with the bedding in the feeding area, and they didn't end up destroying the partition in the process of trying to seek out a more carbon-rich food source that goes along with just the more nitrogen-rich kitchen scraps I would have used to put into the feeding area. And I don't even remember what types of foods we put in there, but it was probably stuff that was meant to really attract them and make them want to stay. So like I said, this doesn't have to be a precise thing. So I think we'll just leave it at that in terms of the number of worms we're hauling out there. Like I said, we're going to get another view of this once we release them, but the next order of business here is going to be to just rebuild this feeding zone. And I guess, you know, it is probably a fair assumption that we're going to still have worms in the finished castings and that this migration does need to continue, but I guess it would make good sense to, let's just set this stuff aside briefly. Let's examine the finished castings, because I've been surprised in the past to find that a migration that I thought would take a whole lot longer was actually suddenly finished unexpectedly. That's the sort of pleasant surprise you get once in a while, but just the sheer number of worms we observed in this material last time we were in here is just sort of a preview to me that says there's probably still going to be some migration left to happen here. So I guess over here where it's been uncovered is where you would expect to see the fewest number of worms, and we're definitely getting there. I don't see any worms out on the far edge. It's just closer to the horizontal migration feeding zone, which is where we were still seeing some worms hanging out. And you know, I guess, well, here we go. We found one or two over here. A couple brave souls hanging out in the material that's tending to dry off at this point. But the worms don't seem to be terribly put off by it. They're still over there. So this will take a little bit longer, and that was what I expected, and that's the reason we held on to some of that bedding, to reuse it and recycle it. And I guess the other thing at this point would also be just take this opportunity to combine some of this drier material out on this edge that is almost completely evacuated with some of this more damp stuff that's closer to the area where the feeding zone was, where the moisture was preserved with the plastic coverings and, you know, set up to continue recirculating there and keep that environment nice and cozy for the worms. In the past, I'd always thought to myself, hey, they're already here, they made it this far, don't disturb, you know, don't set them back. But, you know, I think there's an advantage to taking some of this dry stuff from this edge and combining it with the damp stuff over there and sort of homogenizing it all and getting it all to one consistent, even dryness or dampness level, whatever you want to think of it as. And I think just by doing that, it will promote the entire contents of the container to become a more dry consistency. Because don't forget, the end game here is evacuated castings. So anything we could do to dry out the more damp stuff, I think is going to work to our advantage. And it is kind of fun just to pick through and check out the material, and I guess it's also given us a sense of exactly how many more, not exactly, but you know, roughly how many more worms we need to haul out of here, and it does look like we've got quite a few that still need to evacuate. So I did, you know, hold off on bringing food down from the kitchen for the rebuild, just on the, I guess, off chance that maybe this migration did suddenly come to an end much more quickly than anticipated. But I think the evidence is clear that there's still some work to be done here. So let's take a quick break. I'm gonna head up to the kitchen and get some foods for them with which we can rebuild this horizontal migration feeding zone. And then we could proceed to the launch of the new system with the worms that we just hauled out. So it's going to be break time now. I'm going to head up to the kitchen and I'll be right back. Well, you know, I probably didn't have to bring down this plastic container because I could have just grabbed this whole block of food the way it is and brought it down here. But I've got some stuff other than just this food lined up here. I'm going to include grit because I believe some of the worms coming out of this could be babies that were hatched here. And that was part of the reason we wanted to let this migration go for a while anyway. And baby worms might not have that much grit yet in their systems. And besides my prepared bedding that I've got here with which we're going to rebuild, I've also got a replacement cover because the one they chewed up is pretty far gone, and it's just going to come back into the system as part of the bedding that we're going to include down there, as well as some of this recycled corn. I almost forgot about that. So you know what, let's start off with just a handful of the prepared bedding that I've got. You know what, we gotta move things aside. Still got a couple worms hanging out over here, or maybe we've just got a number of worms that were out here on the edge inside of some material that was nice and damp and comfortable, and now that I stirred it with the dry stuff, I can probably sense the drastic change in the dryness of the material they're occupying now, with me having blended in the fairly dry stuff. So let's see, I usually start out with some sort of a little divider that helps me keep this stuff uncontaminated, clean. So since this is going to ultimately be responsible for doing exactly that, let's just place it in here. It'll go up vertically once we've got a little stuff that we can backfill with. And you know, this recycled piece of bedding might as well just stay right where it is. We'll drop it in here at the bottom. I just figured I'd spread it out, and couldn't remember how many pieces of recycled corn we had. It wasn't that much, it seems. So that'll be at the very base over here. And then we can start coming in with, I guess a few handfuls of this stuff would easily fit in here. Let's see how much we can throw in. I'd like for the feeding zone to be pretty nicely sized for these little guys. It looks like we could probably get this job done with maybe 3 handfuls of this material. Looks like it's doing a pretty good job bringing the level up. And a little something I like to include sometimes inside of a nice fresh load of bedding is my worm chow. So before we drop in the veggies, we'll sprinkle this bedding with a little bit of this pulverized bird seed. It's got some neem seed meal in it. There's some mixed nuts that I pulverized as well. And it's just a mishmash of whatever it is that I just happen to have laying around at the time. A little bit of diatomaceous earth was used to help me grind the nuts up, and the ground nuts would have sort of a sticky consistency to them, but by grinding them with an anti-clumping agent, just like the diatomaceous earth, you can get nice fine material out of it. I think I even had some cornstarch and some other more powdery stuff in there. And now we could bring in the food. So let's see, what we have in here is, I guess there's some potato peels I see. There's some leaves of something. My mom contributed this stuff, so I'm not certain what all of it is, but it might be beets, I think. And I see some carrot. I see some of that white carrot too, so some stuff that was used to make soup, I assume. It's also mixed in here. So I think we've got ourselves a pretty decent feeding area, but we certainly don't need to belabor this task here. I think we can get right to setting it up. So let's start backfilling here. I'm gonna add just a little bit more covering bedding over here on the other side of the partition, and then we could backfill with this stuff. And now we can get a sense of how our level is holding up. And we're going to continue to leave this uncovered so that it continue to shed some of its moisture. And it does seem like it did a nice job shedding a good bit of its moisture by being uncovered. You might have heard it shut off before, but my furnace is going and it's forced hot air. And that ends up being the cause of the air in the house being pretty dry. I grew up in a place where you had like baseboard heat, where you had just those radiators, and those transmit the heat into the air just by sitting there and radiating their heat, as opposed to what I have now, which is the forced hot air, which constantly pushes the hot air out into the house. And I guess to do that, it needs to suck in the cool air. And I guess in that process of heating it, it also tends to dry it. The grid that we're seeing here, this is pulverized eggshell. That's my typical source of grit in my worm bins. And you know, I think there's this piece of cardboard was sort of helping us establish this dividing line. I figured, you know what, why don't we just toss it in here, become part of their bedding that they can crawl into and whatever. Make use of that as well, since it doesn't really serve much of a purpose anymore. I think this one's doing a good enough job just on its own. I can't even remember why we needed that other one. Somehow it just helped some way. It's terrible that I can't remember stupid little things like that. So I guess my aim was to try to come to a point where we're at about the same level so that I can use that as sort of a reference point to judge how much has been eaten, depleted over time. So just proceed with the covering up of this feeding area. We could bring back these little recycled covers. They used to actually be in the yellow buckets when the worms still lived over there. These things each covered a bucket, but you know what? Before we put those on, we also want to preserve what moisture's in here using our plastic coverings, and then we could put on the shade. So the whole idea here is just, oops, look at this little worm inside the bag. That's how you get in trouble, buddy. Okay. That's it. I think we're in good shape here. This plastic bag will definitely help keep the moisture that's down within the system in place. All those delicious foods, as they thaw, since they're all frozen and they start to thaw, they're going to kick out moisture. But you know what? We're done here. Let's get the other bin out. Let's release the worms. Yeah, I gotta tell you, this thing's got some nice weight to it. A couple pounds easy. And, well, now we get to introduce them to their new home. And while they're squirming into place, I'll grab my marker and create a nice new label for the bin. But before we can consider this as an occupied bin, we need to occupy it. So, without further ado, let's introduce these little guys to their new home. Remember, I'm looking for everyone's input on how many worms you think we've released here today, so let's go. See one here. Thought I saw one at the bottom. There he is. I'll check that again, but let's make sure all these little guys have kind of equal access to the material below them. I'll spread them out a little bit here. And once they're situated, we can cover up and we'll be done. Most of the worms are now down in the bedding, and I noticed that I had this little guy on my glove here as I was making up the label, and I also noticed this little guy on the wall of the bin. Just wanted to get him off there too, because it's an awfully dry place to be if you're a worm. So let's make sure we don't leave any poor little guys stranded. Some of the really small ones are tough to spot when they're on your glove. So like I said, I was busy preparing a new label for this system so that once the worms are in there, we can make it official. So let's do that now. All right, everyone, please join me in welcoming the newest bin to my systems. The European night crawlers in the new black box. All right, everyone, that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's really... Oh, yeah. Please don't forget. Let me know. How many worms do you think we released there? I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone. Like I said, thank you so much, everyone. Don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel, too. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.